You really don't know today. You could care less. Let's look at the way this particular individual controls people. He uses a form of management which we call participative. He believes in the law of fair exchange. And he uses earned authority and positional authority with firmness. He doesn't move. His position is based on principle. Now, let's look at his emotions. They're very soft because they are based on love for people. Now, so that you don't think he's a soft individual, let me assure you that he is the most aggressive of the 5 groups we've discussed tonight. But the aggression is toward what? Things. Now, this takes some skill. I've got to be able to take a sledgehammer, if I so desire, and break this table into 1,000,000 pieces because I own it. But if I have an employee that's not serving me as satisfactorily as this table isn't, do I do the same kind of treatment to him? You learn that people are people and things are things, and you have aggression toward things and no aggression toward people. Now, can you set yourself up in this particular frame of mind? If something material gets in my way, what's going to happen? Well, when I get through with it, you won't even know it's there. You get this feeling? If a human being gets in my way, I'm going to move around him without him even knowing I was there. Now, don't for a moment think that these soft emotions mean that you don't have firmness. I'm thinking of the time this man was in a life raft, and this lady was crying, and she became hysterical. She thought she was going to die out there in the ocean. This ideal individual took the back of his hand and come right across the side of her face with all the might he had. Now, is that softness? Yes. Did he do this for her benefit? He snapped her out of it. In other words, he knew he had to do something drastic right away, and this is what he did. Now, was he satisfying his own emotions? Not one bit. Our next column on our chart is fear. And this is the one distinguishing characteristic about an ideal individual. He has no fear. Some people wonder, do you mean absolutely none? Absolutely none. We've talked about fear on many of the sessions, and we finally come up to the ideal individual, and we have a person who lives apart from fear. Now, I would like to tell you the only difference between our administrative assistant and our ideal individual is fear. A lot of people want to know, how can I move from this administrative assistant classification to an ideal individual? Let's look at it this way. If you were in school and you were making A's, and you made an F down here with fear, and I average your grades, you're going to come out with a B? Now, how can I get rid of the B average? If I eliminate this F, where do you automatically go? To an all-A average again? Then is it possible to be an ideal individual and be afraid? No, because what we're averaging is your affectional fields. And you have to have all of your affectional fields up in the top of the positive aura for your average to come out in the top. So real simple. If you want to move to an ideal individual tonight, wipe out fear. The minute you bring fear into your life, you pull your average right down to mediocrity, and you become nothing again. Back to our mother hen. What'd they run for? They were afraid. How much time do you suppose the average American wastes wrestling with their own fear? All right, now, if you had no fear, would you have some extra time? People have asked me, and I've heard this probably as many times as any other question, my problem is there's not enough hours in the day. How do I get this done? How do I get that done? Well, one of the things to do to increase a 24-hour day to about a 500-hour day is to get rid of all the fear. In other words, are you going to waste all this time wrestling and discussing and arguing with yourself all day long? No, you eliminate this. To really understand an ideal individual, you've got to see him under stress. And as we have discussed the other 5 groups of people tonight, have you noticed that under stress they all have come apart? Let's go back quickly and review. The passive person has either some type of psychological breakdown or psychological withdrawal. The fighter ends up with tension, frustration, and anxiety. The rational realist retreats to a physical environment. The administrative assistant is the mother hen retreat. She looks to her leader. Now let's contrast all of that with our ideal individual. What's he going to do in stress? The first thing he will do is take command. He assumes leadership. I think this is very interesting because as he assumes leadership, does he know what he's going to do? No, if you wait to figure out what you're going to do, what's happened to your group? Chaos. So the first thing you do in a situation of crisis, you move in and take over. Now, do you have to give an appearance to the female roles that you know what you're going to do when you take over? But do you? We're beginning to see how much confidence you have to display as an ideal individual. Now, your confidence is based on the fact that when you take over, you know you'll figure it out. All right, now, he's taken complete command of the situation, and have I solved the major problem of all crises already? I mean, the people are not scattered. In other words, they're looking to me for a solution. All right, now the next thing I'm going to do, and I'm going to do it rather hurriedly, I'm going to start a learning process. And I'm going to learn what is wrong that's caused the problem. Now, the minute I learn what the problem is, did you know a wonderful thing has already happened? I've solved it. Now, is it a crisis to me? Isn't that simple? But is it still a crisis to the people? So now I turn around real quick and help everybody be right. They're all dead wrong. But I'm going to teach them all the most brilliant thing. I'm going to compliment them, tell them they're right. Now, as I help others be right, I have a motive. I want to unify the group. You say, where's my ethics? Where's my morals? My purpose at this stage of the game is to actually set up a unity relationship so I can carry out a plan of action. Am I going to sit there and argue with you? You ever seen people in a crisis situation? They sit there? Can't do it that way. Why not? We've done it this way for 20 years. We're going to do it this way. Well, it won't work. You can't be that dumb, can you? Let me show you why it won't work. Well, that time the thing blew up. You walk in, you say, you're right. I'll tell you, it's wonderful. How'd you ever figure that out? Now, if you just do this and move this over here, we got your plan put in action. Now, what's he doing? He's carrying out my plan. He thinks it's his plan. He won't know until it's all over. And he'll probably never know. In fact, he'll be so elated, he'll probably tell everybody it was his idea when it was over. And he probably won't even know he had an idea in the beginning. And the problem is over. Now, I'll give you 2 illustrations. There was a fire in the Coconut Grove in Chicago. Now, this was not a fire sufficiently severe to have caused any death. In other words, if we'd had an ideal individual in there, we could have gotten everybody out alive. But without one ideal individual, what do you suppose happened? They panicked. And as they run for the door, they didn't get it opened. So the first few bodies hit the door and were smashed. And the bodies were piled up 17 deep. In other words, it wasn't that kind of a disaster. But how would you like to go in and start pulling bodies off of bodies 17 deep? I'd like to contrast this with another fire in another theater where the whole theater burnt to the ground. and not one person was killed. Wasn't even anybody killed from smoke damage. But it happened that we had an ideal individual. He organized that thing completely, right from the stage. And by the way, he was not an employee there at all. He was in the audience. He organized it, and they marched out of that theater in file. He assured them that there was nothing wrong, that we're all going to get out alive. This group here will move this way, and this group here will move this way. And they orderly followed his instructions. And he took over. And by the way, did they question his authority the whole time? Nobody knew whether he worked there or who he was. They just knew that the place is burning down, and this guy's telling me which way to run. It was interesting, in this particular theater, he made everybody sit still until they got the doors open, so they couldn't have a pile-up against the door. Now, to what extent would an ideal individual set up false situations if he had to carry out the group to its conclusion successfully? I'll give you a story of Eddie Rickenbacker. He's on this raft in the middle of the Pacific. They're going to die. He realizes that these people are panicking, and they have their minds based on the fear of dying. Now, you realize that fear is right next to indifference in our negative syndrome. And if they continue to fear, are they going to die psychologically? They're going to go into withdrawal state of a vegetable. Now, what he wants to do is move them to a positive aura. Now, how would you move some fanatical people, half hysterical, on a rubber raft to a positive aura? I'll show you how he did it. He went down to the emotion just above fear, which is hatred. And he caused everybody on that raft to hate him. And they hated him so bad they wanted to kill him. And when he got him up to an intense hatred of himself, he moved him from the fear level to the hatred level. You ought to read the book. He did all other kinds of things before he got him out, but he brought them all out alive. Would you actually, in a situation, cause the people to hate you? Especially when they outnumbered you and you're on a raft in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. But you see, the ideal individual charts a course of action, and he follows the action. In other words, whatever he has chosen, he pursues it. Now, the reason he can do all these things, where's his fear? Now, the minute I bring ingredient into fear, have I completely crippled him and paralyzed him? There's a man who jumps on the stage in a theater and tells everybody what to do. Is he really afraid he's going to burn to death? No, he's not. He's not even trying to get out, is he? To move quick enough, by the way, to get on the stage before anyone else knows what's going on means could he have made it to the door by himself, probably. An ideal individual always tends to take leadership of people, and there's a reason for this. What does he think of people? Oh, he loves them. In other words, the dearest thing on the whole earth to him are humans, and this is his whole life. Let's go a little further and look at his structure. He's rightly related to a good God, and you have to have a good God. It doesn't do any good to be related to a bad God. If your God's bad tonight and you're related to a bad God, then you just make everybody around you miserable. We've got people in mental institutions because of fear of a bad God. Won't help you a bit. And also, he has structure within himself. We might go into a little bit of self-actualization. He actually lives closer to that maximum potential, and he actually develops himself to the fullest. And the basic secret of developing yourself to the fullest is to eliminate fear. Let's examine some occupations. Now, would you always remember, in all the occupations we've discussed tonight, could we have ideal individuals? Yes. And in these occupations, which tend to attract ideal individuals, could we have all the other groups too? All right, now here's the groups that tend to have ideal individuals. Number one is leaders of all kinds. 2, consultants, doctors, executives, salesmen, statesmen, top management, clergy. Now there's a reason for this. All of these particular occupations, do they deal with people? And you'll find out that as a person grows higher from the bottom of a negative syndrome to the top of a positive aura, he tends to deal less and less with physical things. And he tends to concentrate more and more with people. So that as you arrive at the top of the positive aura, your primary interest on this earth is people. Now contrast this down to the heavy equipment operator and the fighter group. His primary interest is moving that ton of dirt. When we look at this grouping of 5 classifications, let's visualize it as a continuum, with the passive person at one extreme and the ideal individual at the other extreme, with an infinite number of degrees between the two. Now, for an illustration, could you tonight find 100 people, and all of them would fall between an administrative assistant and an ideal individual? In which we could have that many different positions between those two classifications. So tonight you might say, well, I'm half ideal and I'm half administrative assistant. There is another interesting thing too. As you move across the chart, and let's say in 6 months you move from a rational realist to halfway between administrative assistant and an ideal individual, will you still have the grave clothes on of a rational realist? You might pick up a book that might help you change your self-image. A year later, you still will have characteristics of some other columns. There's another reason, too. You might be in a crisis in your life, which will cause you to change, either to improve or to become worse. Therefore, as you move out of one classification into another, will you carry the traits with you from the classification that you were in? Then there's one final reason to be mixed up on the chart. If you're under 25. And again, this is a generality, but normally people under 25 are not integrated yet. All that means is they don't have a clear-cut value system, they don't know which way they're going, they don't know what's up yet. They're still learning about the world. Now, if you're not thoroughly integrated, do you have a lot of backbone, a lot of blocks, and a lot of definite ideas? No. Then you tend to fall below an ideal individual. Now also this person under 25, could he actually feel like that part of him is in all 5 classifications? And the reason for that is, does he know who he is yet? In the first 25 years, you're still learning who you are. By the way, you'll never know who you are. But normally when you pass 25, you begin to gather some kind of an idea of who you are. Now I'd like to actually show you something else rather striking on the same affectional field diagram using the 5 classifications as a basis. And we're going to call this a spice cake. And we're going to start on the line at the bottom above indifference. Now the reason we can't have anything below the line is because nothing actually exists below the line of indifference. Now as we begin, we're going to go from indifference up through doubts. In this particular area we're going to call physical. Now you'll see this classification of the spice cake, which is our need structure, will almost coincide with our 5 groups of people. We say that the person who is a passive person and who is in indifference, does he have needs? No. This is a vegetable without needs. Now as we cross the indifference line, we begin our first needs, and they're going to be, first of all, air, water, food, shelter, clothing, and physical sex. And they will be in that order. Now, if tonight you are struggling for air, we say you're in a negative syndrome. Now, I realize later on it's going to be possible to be an ideal individual and struggle for air. But initially, when you come on this earth, as you struggle for air, does anything else matter? I have to have the oxygen. Now, as soon as I am satisfied with the oxygen, do I want it anymore? Nobody here for the past hour has been doing any fighting for oxygen. In fact, you weren't even conscious of it, that you even have been breathing. We say your need is satisfied, so you go up to water. Now, as I completely conquer water, I go to food. Now, what do you suppose happens when I go to the top of the physical wants? Well, I could move into the next area, which is the psychological structure of you. Our first layer of our cake is made up of the physical, and we have 6 small layers. And as you satisfy each layer, you progress to the next. Now, what you should do to be normal is pass the final layer of physical sex and progress to the psychological needs. But this doesn't always happen with everybody. Some people suffer from what we call fixation. Instead of going on into some psychological need structure, they go back and get more food. Now they've got 6 houses. Now they've got 100 pair of shoes. We say that they are trying to satisfy their needs, which are psychological and social and spiritual, all in the area of the physical. Now, the area below the line believes in scarcity. There's not enough. They know there's not enough to go around. Now, they have 6 houses and 100 pairs of shoes, and they still know what? Does it make any difference how much they acquire physically? Their philosophy is still scarcity. Now, when you go above the line, your philosophy will be abundance. And abundance simply means, is there enough for everybody? And you believe it. Right now, let's assume that I don't fixate anywhere in the physical, and I go into the psychological. We can say that my needs change from to live, which would be in the physical, to the psychological now, which would be to achieve. In other words, I want to be something. I want to do something. And as I move into achievement, have I moved into the rational realist territory? What's his God? It's that book I just finished. It has all the theories in the world. Everything is just perfect in this book. By the way, what's going to happen to this book? It's going to be adopted by every college in the world. It's the famous text. 10 years later, what are they going to do with it? Throw it in the trash. It's outdated. Now, he has a struggle here, doesn't he? He has to keep ahead and keep revising it, or his God becomes out of date. But he worships his achievements. Let's go back to our fighter, our aggressive man down here. What's his God? Physical. And he frames everything in relationship to the physical. Now, people fear you taking their gods away from them. And there's a reason for this. Our God basically is our structure. And we can show this because everything in my life is related to everything else. And finally, it's related to an absolute, which is the structure of my being. And the structure gives me continuity. It gives me a framework upon which I can hang everything. Now, the fighter, his structure is physical. Could you burn his house down? Could a moth eat his suit? Is everything that he worships in a position of being destroyed always? Is he very secure? Every moment he is threatened by everything. So he's continuously grabbing. Now do you understand why he's a fighter? And let's look at his emotions. Doubt, suspicion, greed, hatred, and fear. If you fixate and use for structure anything physical, then these are the emotions that will correspond with it. And then you will live in a negative syndrome. All right, now let's go a little step higher. This man who wants to achieve, what's his emotions? He evaluates. He uses constructive criticism. Does this sound like a noble, rational realist? He has some criticism and he doubts, and once in a while he gets a suspicion. By the way, we call a suspicion a hypothesis. A common word for a suspicion or a hypothesis would be a hunch. The scientist comes down to the suspicion area until he gets his hunch, and he goes back up to the line and works on it. And then once in a while, if he gets away from pure research and he moves into applied research, might he go above the line to relate it to people? But this is always an interesting thing to me. When you talk to scientists, who is the most noble, pure or applied? Pure. And yet he does not relate anything he does to people, whereas applied relates it to people. All right, now let's go back to our scientist. Now, as this physical scientist comes above the line, he has to think of people, because the line separates in a very clear distinction people on the top and things on the bottom. As the scientist crosses the rational line, a wonderful thing takes place in his life. He distinguishes between animals and things and people. And we say that the first day is acknowledgement, where I acknowledge you as a human being. There are what we call the 7 O's, and they actually fit on the rational line to show you the problem that you meet when you meet the rational line. And let's go through them tonight and show you what I mean. These 7 O's, I think, cause most of the trouble of the fighting of the world. Now that we have the 7 O's, are you beginning to see that the rational line becomes a very strong line? The only people who have a license to go back and forth on it are rational realists. And it tends to keep our aggressive aggravators and our administrative assistants totally separate from each other. Now, this rational realist, the reason that he can cross the line, and this particular line here shows you the behavior of the rational realist. And to actually demonstrate this, let's show that any line on an affectional field diagram that is horizontal has no change of emotion. And a vertical line in relationship to time axis and intensity of emotion on the y-axis shows a lot of change in emotion. Now, a line that slopes just a little shows a little change in emotion. Now let's go through the 5 groups hurriedly, and I'll show you what I mean. On the indifference level with a passive person, we run a straight line. Do they have any change in emotion? No, vegetable. They're the same tomorrow as they were today. No actual change. Let's look at our fighter group. They tend to come up, down, but large fluctuations. And these large fluctuations are due to the actual disturbance of emotions in their life. But the reason they tend to level off is because they are more influenced by past averages than they are by present situations.